Hello everyone, welcome back to History 2201, Ancient Greece and Rome. In this video, we're going to discuss some of the civilizations that came in contact with the Romans and that had a major impact on the development of the Roman civilization, the Roman culture, and the course of Roman history. The first civilization we're going to discuss was on the Italian peninsula with the Romans. They're called the Etruscans. After that, we're going to discuss a civilization, or rather a collection of peoples, to the north of the Romans, called the Celts. And then finally, we'll conclude the video by discussing a civilization to the south, the Carthaginians. This map illustrates the diversity of the Italian peninsula and surrounding islands at about the time the city of Rome was founded, circa 753 BCE. As you can see, the Etruscans are to the north of the Romans, and then there are other groups like the Samnites, Umbrians, of course Magna Graecia to the south, as well as the Sardinians on the island of Sardinia. In this video, we're not going to discuss every single group of people that the Romans came into contact with early in their civilization. We're going to focus on the Etruscans and the Celts, and then the Carthaginians, three peoples that had a major impact on the development of Roman civilization and culture. Before I move on, though, I should add that the Greeks influenced the Romans as well, something we've discussed in previous lecture videos. The Greeks were neighbors of the Romans, both in Sicily and on the Italian peninsula, what was called Magna Graecia, or Greater Greece, because of the large Greek population in the southern Italian peninsula. The Romans also had contact with the Greek mainland across the Adriatic Sea. Greek culture, art, and architecture would inspire the Romans both directly through their interactions with the Greeks, and then indirectly as the Romans interacted with other civilizations that had elements of Greek culture, most notably the Etruscans. And the image on this slide is of the Greek temple to Concordia, the goddess of order. This temple was built from about 430 to 420 BCE, and it was built in Sicily. And of course, as the Romans adopted elements of Greek culture, they made their own changes and modifications, as did the Etruscans, who we're going to discuss in a moment. Now I want to talk about the origins of the Etruscan civilization, because one, there are several explanations for where the Etruscan civilization came from that are, I think, very mysterious and very interesting. I also want to mention the origins of the Etruscan civilization because it's possible that the Etruscan people may have shared a common ancestor with the Roman people. Anyway, what we think of as the Etruscan civilization began around the 900s BCE and continued until about 265 BCE when the Etruscans were basically absorbed by the Romans, although there may have been small pockets of Etruscan culture even after 265. As I mentioned before, the exact origins of the Etruscan civilization are unknown, but it's believed that they possibly came from a Bronze Age people called the Proto-Villanovan culture that inhabited northern Italy. The Proto-Villanovan culture will develop into the Villanovan culture as well. And the Proto-Villanovans may themselves have come from another northern Italian culture that inhabited the Po River Valley, a little bit north of where the Etruscans were. And that group of people was called the Terramare or Terramare culture, if you're going to pronounce it the Italian way. The Terramare, they lived probably between the 1650s and the 1200s BCE. They're a Bronze Age civilization that some people theorize were also ancestors of the Romans, But either way, the Terra Mare culture leads to the Proto-Villanovan culture of the 1200s to the 900s BCE. And then something takes place, and the Proto-Villanovan culture kind of breaks off into the Villanovan culture of the 900s to 700s BCE. And then the Etruscan culture, with which you're probably a bit more familiar. And then Etruscan culture, of course, is going to be a force in Italy from the 900s to about 265 BCE. And there's some similarities between the Proto-Villanovans and the Etruscans, enough that we think that the Proto-Villanovans were kind of intermediate between older cultures and the Etruscans. There's archaeological discoveries to back this up. Both use very similar tools and weapons, and both practice cremation of the dead, that is, the burning of the bodies of the deceased. The Terra Mare culture also practiced cremation as well, highlighting that the Terra Mare were probably ancestors of all of these people. The Villanovan culture, which sort of splits off from Proto-Villanovan about the same time the Etruscans come around, seems to be less influenced by other Mediterranean cultures, like the Greeks, for example. They seem to have had more connections with Celtic peoples that were to the north, like in northern Italy, and then in what is now southern Austria and southern Switzerland. The Etruscans, however, are going to have a lot of connections with the Mediterranean world, particularly with the Greeks. There are also some theories for why Etruscan material culture is so Mediterranean in its flavor. We think that perhaps some of the people who became Etruscans, they may have not actually been from Italy. They may have been from the Eastern Mediterranean, possibly Anatolia, and they settled in northern Italy, intermarrying with Proto-Villanovan people to create a new Etruscan culture. We don't know for sure because we have not deciphered the Etruscan language, and a lot of the sources we have about the Etruscans are written by the Greeks and the Romans, who generally had a pretty negative opinion of the Etruscans. But we'll talk a bit more about how other civilizations view the Etruscans later in this video. Some people think that the Villanovans were the ancestors of the Romans. Basically, the Terra Mare people gave rise to the Proto-Villanovans, who gave rise to the Villanovans, and then the Villanovans became the Latin Italic people who then founded the city of Rome. And of course, the Latin Italic people were rivals of the Etruscans. And some others think that basically the Terra Mare culture basically survived and became the Latin Italic culture, which then became the Roman culture. There's a lot of speculation here as to the relationship between the Etruscans, the Romans, and then the civilizations that came before the Etruscans and the Romans. But we'll explain that a little bit more later in the video. The image on this slide is a bronze Villanovan helmet from the 900s BCE. This specific example is held at the Met Museum in New York City, and the later Etruscans are also going to make this style of helmet too. But over time, the Etruscans are going to move away from this style of helmet, which has more of a Northern European, possibly Celtic style to it, and they're going to use more like Greek style armor and weapons, highlighting how the Etruscans become much more of a Mediterranean culture producing civilization. They produce more like Mediterranean material culture, which I'll give examples of in this video. This slide shows an image of a Proto-Villanovan cinerary urn, basically a urn that held ashes, possibly the ashes of human remains. This one was found near Rome. Obviously, it was made centuries before Rome was founded. This piece of pottery comes from the 1200s to 900s BCE. Rome was said to have been founded in 753 BCE. On the other side of the slide is a modern reconstruction of what a Terra Mare settlement might have looked like in the Po region, 1600s to 1200s BCE. The Terra Mare people, they seem to have been very skilled with building and architecture. They would have moats diverted from rivers around their settlements, as you can see here. They would build earthen dikes that also served as walls. These walls slash dikes would have kept the water out of the settlements, but they also would have been very good fortifications as well. And inside the settlement, the Terramare people built houses on stilts. That way, if their dikes ever broke down, their homes would not be destroyed. We also see that the Terramare settlements seem to have been set up on a grid pattern with streets running either parallel to each other or perpendicular to each other. And later Roman settlements will be set up on a grid pattern as well. So because of the similarities in how their settlements are built, some people think that the Terramare culture were also ancestors of the Romans, either because the Terramare were the ancestors of the Proto-Villanovans who became Romans, or because the Romans came from the Terramare via the Latin Italic people. Now I want to talk about Etruscan society as a whole. This map shows Etruscan society about the year 750 BCE, about the time the city of Rome was said to have been founded. And then this lighter color here shows the expansion of Etruscan culture and civilization, extending through Latin territory past Rome. It's possible that the Latin people, whoever they were descended from, saw the Etruscans as a threat, and that's what led them to found the city of Rome. Basically, we believe that Rome was a collection of settlements on hills in the Tiber River Valley, and basically they were consolidated into a larger town that became the city of Rome. And that may have been because of Etruscan invasions in the region. What's interesting about the Etruscans is there's multiple names for them. The Etruscans probably called themselves the Ravenna. The Greeks called them the Tyrrhenians, and of course the Romans called them the Etruscans. And Etruscan culture tends to be pretty similar to Greek culture at about the same time in history. Typically, the Etruscans are usually a little bit behind the Greeks in terms of like material culture styles that are being used, sculpture styles, painting styles. They're usually a couple hundred years behind. Just it takes time for ideas and styles to diffuse, but the Etruscans definitely were influenced by Greek culture, and they will modify Greek culture. And the Romans will adopt a lot of Greek culture directly from the Greeks, but also kind of a second-hand version of Greek culture from the Etruscans. You'll see things like the Orientalizing tradition in Etruscan sculpture, for example, that comes from the Greeks. Just it takes a little bit of time to develop amongst the Etruscans. The Etruscans also will make similar styles of pottery, especially red and black figure pottery. And as I mentioned, the Etruscans were a significant military threat to the people of Rome. Documentary sources indicate this, that the Etruscans were major enemies of the Romans, which is one of the reasons why the Romans often wrote very negatively about the Etruscans, which can make the sources the Romans write about the Etruscans not always as reliable as we would like. Here I want to mention the Etruscan language, which has, as of the making of this video, has not been fully deciphered. The Etruscan alphabet seems to have been based on a version of the Greek alphabet, and if you look at the Greek alphabet and the Latin alphabet, it's pretty easy to see that the Etruscan alphabet is sort of an intermediary between the Greek and Latin alphabet, meaning that the Romans probably got their writing system secondhand. It came to them originally from the Greeks, but through the Etruscans, and then, of course, the Romans made modifications to develop the Latin alphabet. And we have not been able to decipher the Etruscan alphabet as of yet. There's a couple of reasons why. The first is because there's not many long Etruscan inscriptions that have been found. We find, short documents, stelae like this, which have a lot of writing, are pretty atypical when you're investigating Etruscan archaeological sites. And we haven't found a Etruscan Rosetta Stone that shows the undeciphered Etruscan language alongside a deciphered language like Greek or Latin. If we found something like that, we would be able to translate Etruscan. In addition, and this is what I think is very interesting and what makes the Etruscans so mysterious, is unlike most of the other civilizations around them, like the Romans and their predecessors, like the Terra Mare, the Etruscans don't seem to have spoken an Indo-European language. As you remember from previous videos, the Indo-European people moved through Western Europe, including the Italian peninsula. Languages like Latin and Greek are both Indo-European languages, meaning they come from the Proto-Indo-European language. But for whatever reason, the Etruscan people don't seem to have spoken an Indo-European language. That doesn't mean they don't have Indo-European ancestry, but for whatever reason, they speak a different language, which makes translating Etruscan difficult as well. But Latin, which is an Indo-European language, does have some Etruscan terms. We think terms like military and person may have come from Etruscan, as well as a lot of religious words and religious terms, which we'll discuss later in this video. So the Etruscans have a very interesting and mysterious language that, as of yet, has not been translated. This is the Tomb of the Leopards in Tarquinia, in the northern part of Etruscan territory. And the Etruscans built very elaborate and richly decorated tombs, as you can see. These paintings are a type of fresco, although the Etruscans also made dry paintings as well. Remember, frescoes are painted into wet, fresh plaster. As the wet, fresh plaster dries, it preserves the paint a lot better than a painting done on a dry surface. So when you see an Etruscan painting that is very well preserved, usually it's because it's a fresco. Other paintings that are much more faded or chipped were probably painted dry, or rather onto a dry surface. Interesting observations we can make about Etruscan paintings is that they're very similar in style to Greek paintings from the same period. Like a lot of Greek paintings, they portray men with darker skin, although sometimes men are portrayed with lighter skin as well. So there's some difference between Greek and Etruscan paintings, but a lot of the scenes are very similar to scenes from Greek paintings at the same time. This tomb painting, which is actually of a Etruscan funerary banquet, is very similar to contemporary paintings done of Greek symposia or symposiums, which are basically ancient Greek parties where men drank a lot of alcohol. Nowadays, when we hear the word symposium, we think of an academic conference. It's very stuffy and very formal. But for the Greeks, a symposium was a wild party. And for the Etruscans, funerary banquets were not somber affairs. They were celebrations of the life of the deceased in which large amounts of alcohol were consumed, food would have been eaten, and then there would have been dancing and music as well. So they were basically very wild funeral parties. A lot like, say, a New Orleans style funeral today, but even more exuberant. So we'll make some notes about Etruscan culture as seen through its art. It was said that Etruscan society was very hedonistic and it was focused on pleasure and comfort above all else. Now, we've heard this from Roman and Greek historians, especially Roman historians, but the Romans would have been very biased against the Etruscans because early on in Roman history, the Etruscans would have been rivals on the Italian peninsula, and then eventually the Romans are going to take over and basically acculturate the Etruscan people. So they're going to want to make the Etruscans sound selfish, pleasure-seeking, perhaps much more so than they actually were. Although I think there is some archaeological evidence that suggests that the Etruscan society did privilege pleasure-seeking. It probably wasn't the most important thing of their society, but it certainly would have been an important part of Etruscan culture. But Roman historians talking about the Etruscans used to say very outlandish things about Etruscan civilization. They used to say things like, in the Etruscan city-states, it was illegal to own roosters because roosters would crow in the morning and wake people up too early. Things that, to a modern reader, really sound pretty absurd, but make sense from the Roman context as the Romans tried to show that the Etruscans were weak compared to the Romans. But I do want to emphasize there was elements of pleasure seeking in the Etruscan culture, and their art shows that. The tomb paintings, like the one on the previous slide, and on this slide as well, show a culture that prioritized music, feasting, dancing, entertainment, even in funerals. What's interesting as well is that Etruscan art and sculpture depicts both women and men together, and often in embrace, highlighting their culture's notions of sexuality. It's also believed that Etruscan culture was less patriarchal than many other ancient Mediterranean cultures, and that women would have had, comparatively, more power and authority in Etruscan society. But scholars, of course, debate this point, because we have archaeological and material evidence, but we don't have any documentary evidence really written by the Etruscans themselves. Any kind of documentary evidence, written evidence we have, is written by especially the Romans, and it's written much later, and there's often a bias to it. We'll talk more about Etruscan women a little bit later in this video. Here, we'll talk about the sarcophagus of the spouses from about the 500s BCE. This is probably the most well-known Etruscan funerary object, possibly the most well-known Etruscan artifact. It's a life-sized anthropoid casket made from terracotta. It features a man and woman carved in the Greek Orientalizing style. If you look at the facial features and the hairstyles of the male and female subject of this piece, they're very done in the Orientalizing style. And this piece, remember, is from the 500s BCE. By the 500s BCE, the Greeks had begun to move away from the Orientalizing style. As I said, it takes time for styles to pass from Greece to the Etruscans. This piece was meant to be an urn for the ashes of a husband and wife. The ashes would be placed after the two had passed away, or after one had passed away and then the other passed away years later. It's opened via a crack in their waists, so it's actually 4 pieces. This is one piece, this is another piece, this is another piece, and this is the last piece. So it's a 4-piece anthropoid casket that would have held ashes. And this type of casket or sarcophagus seems to have been used by poorer Etruscans as well, but the workmanship on their urns is of a lot lower quality, and they tend to be a lot smaller. They may also have made smaller sarcophagi for children as well, but I'll show a couple of examples of other Etruscan sarcophagi in the next couple of slides. And this differing size and quality in Etruscan funerary sarcophagi shows that Etruscan society was very socially stratified. There was an elite upper class that could afford very nice, very ornate sarcophagi like this one here. And then there was a poorer class that had to do with cheaper and simpler urns. And this piece is, it was made supposedly between 530 and 510 BCE, and it's at the National Etruscan Museum in Rome. This is a painted version of the sarcophagus of the spouses. It is maybe 10 years or 20 years newer, more recent than the sarcophagus of the spouses shown on the previous slide. They may have actually been made by the same sculptor or workshop because of their similarities, aside from the fact that this one is painted and the other one is unpainted. This one is at the Louvre in Paris. And here you can see what the sarcophagus of the spouses would have looked like when it was taken apart to have ashes placed inside. I really like the workmanship on both of the sarcophagi. The details, particularly on the feet of the man and woman, are very good. You can see the man's bare feet, but then you can see the woman is wearing kind of a type of pointy shoe, which I think is very interesting. She's also wearing a hat of some kind. You'll often find women, when they're portrayed on these sarcophagi urns, they're wearing headwear very similar to this. Here are a couple of examples of less ornate, probably cheaper sarcophagi urns that would have been used by poorer Etruscans. The one on the left shows spouses. It's a smaller, scaled down, less expensive version of the sarcophagus of the spouses that we showed on the previous slide. You can see the woman is wearing a similar kind of hat to the one worn by the woman on the expensive sarcophagus. And on this solo sarcophagus here, the woman is also wearing a pointy hat, a lot like on this sarcophagus on the left, and then also on the more expensive one. So you can see a continuity in women's fashion and styles in these funerary objects. This is a much later Etruscan/Roman style sarcophagus. You can see it's anthropoid, featuring a woman in repose, but the subject is portrayed much more in a Roman style and wearing Roman clothing. The fashion is totally different, but it would open up in a similar manner to the much older Etruscan sarcophagi, showing that even after the Romans had taken over the Etruscan civilization and brought Roman culture to the Etruscan people, elements of the Etruscan culture will persist, as seen by this sarcophagus. A little bit more discussion about Etruscan tombs. Unlike the Greeks, their neighbors across the Adriatic Sea, the Etruscans liked to build very nice, very extensive tombs. Wealthier people would have painted the interiors of their tombs with varieties of paintings and frescoes, and they would have had very nice sarcophagi like the ones we looked at on the previous slides. So they're adopting some elements of Greek culture, but they're also making their own traditions. Remember, the Greeks in the Archaic and the Classical period did not like to build large, extensive tombs. They thought tombs like that were impure, and it's not really until the Hellenistic period that you see big, extravagant tombs being built as Greek society becomes more socially stratified. The Etruscans built large family tombs as well. These would have been, multiple family members would have been buried in these tombs. Remember, the Etruscans preferred to practice cremation rather than just burial of bodies. Poorer people would have been buried in smaller, plainer tombs or simply in the ground. Some poorer people who had at least a little bit of money might have buried themselves in a sarcophagus, like the ones we looked at on the previous slides, the less expensive sarcophagi, of course. And this is just another, this image is of the Triclinian tomb in Tarquinia, which is in northern Italy. And one other thing that's interesting is the Etruscans, they like to build their tombs together. They didn't just build their tombs in random places, they built them in what were called necropolises. Necropolis means city of the dead, necro for dead, polis for city. It's a Greek term, and the later Romans will build necropolises as well. And of course, later Greeks will build necropolises, but I think that's all we need to discuss right now for Greek and Roman tombs. We'll get back to Etruscan tombs now. Here are some exteriors of Etruscan tombs. These are larger Etruscan tombs that would have been built more for wealthier people. I think they look like a fusion of Mycenaean Greek Tholos tombs, the dome-shaped tombs that the Mycenaeans built, which we talked about in a previous video, especially their entrances. I mean, these tombs are much smaller than the Tholos tombs, but they also remind me a little bit of earthen barrow tombs, which were built by the people of Northern Europe, especially the Celts. So you're seeing there's a little bit of fusion of Mediterranean and Northern European ideas in the Etruscan tombs. Remember, the Etruscans, before they were the Etruscans, they were the Villanova people, who had more in common with Northern Europeans than they did with Mediterranean Europeans. So You can kind of see a fusion of styles in the exterior of these tombs. Here's another um, Etruscan tomb. This one is also, it's built in a fusion of styles. You can see the entrance with its corbel arch looks a lot like a Tholos tomb, but a much smaller version. And then the earthen top is very reminiscent of a barrow. This is just a aerial shot of a Etruscan necropolis. You can see the larger tombs in the bottom of the image. And then there's much smaller tombs which would have been used by poorer people who could not afford such a large burial site, such a large mausoleum or tomb for themselves. Also, these larger tombs probably would have been family tombs as well. Multiple individuals would have been interred in them. So now we'll talk a little bit about what we know of Etruscan funerary rituals. Keep in mind, we have not fully deciphered the Etruscan language. We're reading the material culture as archaeologists. We know that Greek funerals were somber affairs, featuring things like processions through the city, people wearing dark colors. But Etruscan funerals were much more celebratory affairs. They were celebrations of the dead. They featured music, dancing, feasting, consumption of wine and alcohol. It's a highlight of the more pleasure-seeking nature of Etruscan culture. It's also a sign they may have believed in venerating and perhaps even worshiping the dead. And the image on this slide is a carved slab showing a Etruscan funerary banquet. And it's from, of course, Italy as well. Here's some more Etruscan funerary paintings. We see musicians in this slide. The musicians are playing Greek instruments. This is a aulos flute. That's spelled A-U-L-O-S. And then there's a lyre, L-Y-R-E, which is a type of, similar to a harp, play a stringed instrument popular with the Greeks. This individual, this young male, is holding basically a wine glass. The Greeks liked very shallow wine glasses that were more like bowls, and it would seem that the Etruscans copied the Greeks not only on their musical instruments, but on the vessels from which they consumed wine. So now we'll talk about Etruscan clothing and fashion as shown by their artwork. We think because the Etruscan culture put an emphasis on pleasure seeking, Etruscan clothing was looser and more colorful than that worn by the Greeks. It still has some similarities to Greek clothing, but you see that Etruscan clothing, when it's portrayed, it's always portrayed as being brighter, looser, with very often complex patterns. Men's tunics were very revealing, and actually are in many ways similar more to a Roman toga from centuries later than they are to a Greek tunic. Etruscan women's clothing is a bit more like Greek clothing, but again, it's much more colorful, and it's the patterns are more complex, highlighting that this culture is not taking itself too seriously. Now we can discuss the Etruscan pantheon, their religion. They were polytheistic, like the Greeks and the Romans later on. It seems that they worshiped some of the same gods of the Greeks and the Romans, and that the Etruscans changed the names of the Greek gods, and then the Romans adopted more of the Etruscan name when they adopted elements of the Greek pantheon. There are some differences, though, between the Greek religion and the Etruscan religion, namely in their understanding of death. The Etruscans have two gods of death. They have Aita, god of death, who's similar to the Greek god Hades. He's married to a woman or goddess named Persephone, basically the Etruscan version of Persephone. Again, we talked about the Greek gods in the archaic Greek lecture video if you want reminders about who the Greek gods were. They also worshipped a being called Aplu, who is Apollo, and Artemi, who is basically Artemis. They have two gods of death. Aita is meant to show the more positive elements of death, whereas Kalu was the god of the more negative and frightening elements of death. And he's not really depicted in Etruscan art and sculpture. And the image on this slide is of Aplu, or of Apollo, and it's made in the Orientalizing style in about 500 BCE. So now we'll talk about Etruscan temples, the buildings in which they would have worshipped their gods and goddesses. There are some similarities between Greek temples and Etruscan temples. Scholars debate how much of Etruscan temples was copied from the Greeks. Some scholars even argue that the Greeks actually copied elements from the Etruscans. It's hard to say for sure because there's not many surviving examples of Etruscan temples. Really, most of what we have is just their foundations. The Etruscans built their temples primarily out of wood and out of clay, with some stone, mostly in the foundation. So a lot of these temples would have been burnt to the ground, or they would have been replaced by later Roman temples. So much of what we know about Etruscan temples comes from documentary sources and what little archaeological evidence we have. On this slide are two reconstructions of Etruscan temples. We think that Etruscan temples were probably smaller, made of wood. They would have been raised off of the ground, which is probably a tradition left to the Etruscans by the Proto-Villanovan people. The columns on these temples were very simple. This is called the Tuscan order. If you look at the reconstructions, you can see it's somewhat similar to the Doric order, but there is no fluting, there's no grooves on the columns themselves. We do think that the Etruscan temples would become somewhat larger as they began to use different types of stone, and as they presumably adopted more Greek elements of their culture into their culture. This is a foundation of an Etruscan temple. The foundations were called podiums, like a podium that a person would stand on today. This one is in Orvieto, Italy, and the temple itself has been lost, but the foundation is all that's left because it's made of stone. This is a reconstruction of what the temple of Minerva, or Athena. The Romans and the Etruscans called her Minerva. This is in Veii, Italy, or would have been in Veii, Italy. These temples have large porches in the front where the religious rituals would have taken place. They would not have taken place inside the closed portion of the building, we think. But once again, we don't have a lot of examples of Etruscan temples because they were built mostly with wood. They did decorate the roofs of their temples, though, with ceramic figures of their gods. And we have some reconstructions that we can view to see what these ceramic figures would have looked like. You can see that the decorations are very, very intricate, but because they're made of ceramics as opposed to being made of a stone like marble, they get broken more easily. They're harder for archaeologists to find and reconstruct. The Etruscans used ceramic pottery as well. Very similar in style to Greek pottery. They used the red and the black figures talked about in previous videos. They decorated their pottery with designs from nature and scenes from their mythology. So in many ways, their pottery is very similar to that of the Greeks, and of course similar to the Romans later on. The Etruscans also made bronze sculptures, and their bronze sculptures are interesting. They do adopt elements of Greek and Roman styles later in their history. Early Etruscan bronze sculptures have what is probably a Villanovan influence. They're not as anatomically correct and realistic. Usually early on, they tended to portray gods and elite people. Um, the bronze on the right-hand side of this slide is probably of Laren, their god of war, which would become Mars, the Roman god of war. And this is an image probably of a upper class or an elite man, based on the type of clothing that he's wearing. And these, of course, are early Etruscan bronze sculptures. Etruscan bronze sculptures become more sophisticated with time. This is Menra, goddess of wisdom and war, becomes the Roman goddess Minerva. It's from this specific piece is from about the 400s or 450s BCE. These later Etruscan sculptures are from the 300s to the 200s BCE, and you can see a much more clear Greco-Roman influence on these sculptures. It's also possible the last sculpture, which is the sculpture of a boy. This may have actually been made after the Romans took control of Etruscan territory and began to force Roman culture on the Etruscans. The Etruscans gave many elements of their culture to the Romans, but in the end, the Romans began to give many of their elements of their culture to the Etruscans, albeit forcibly. While we're on the subject of Etruscan sculptures, I want to mention a very important Etruscan archaeological site, one that I think is very interesting and also has provided archaeologists with a lot of examples of Etruscan sculptures. That's the Lake of the Idols in Tuscany. We think that Etruscans probably went to this lake and they threw statues and things into the lake to basically be a votive offering to the gods. And a votive offering is when someone leaves behind a token of some kind in order to gain favor from divine powers. And this was something that religions have done in antiquity, and many religions do today as well. And some of the statues, they include things like this 5-inch tall Kouros or boy bronze statue here. This one is from the 500s BCE. They're statues of gods and of heroes like Hercules or Heracles, as he was known to the Etruscans. The Greeks called him Heracles. And there's also replicas of limbs. And we think these replicas of limbs were thrown into the water by worshippers who were suffering from illnesses. If you had a boil on your arm, for example, you might throw a replica of an arm into the Lake of the Idols with the hope that the gods would heal your arm. And this lake was actually a spring that fed the Arno River, and this body of water may have had healing properties from tannins that were in the water. These tannins basically are a result of the breakdown of plant matter, and they would have given the water this brownish color that you can see, but they may have had healing properties, which led the Etruscans to think that this lake was the domain of the gods. And many figures, over 600, have been found at this site so far, and the figures seem to be of an Etruscan style, but also of a Roman and even a Cisalpine Gaul or Celtic style. So it's very possible that people from all across the Italian peninsula were coming to this site to try to gain favor from the gods and heal their illnesses. So now we'll talk about Etruscan military weapons and armor based on what we've found as archaeologists. There seems to be a fusion of Greek military technology as well as Northern European, primarily Celtic military technology. These early Villanovan helmets definitely have a Celtic influence. The Villanovans liked to make these helmets with these sort of pointed crests, and the Celts early in their history liked to make helmets with points. Over time, the Etruscans began to adopt more Greek-style weapons and armor. They used both bronze and iron to make weapons and armor. Iron, of course, is preferred for weapons like swords and spears. Oftentimes, armor is still made out of bronze, though. Bronze is softer and it's easier to make into complex shapes. But iron is much harder and will keep an edge a lot better. It's also believed that the Etruscans developed some of the best military footwear of the ancient world. They made very sturdy sandals, which we believe the Romans adopted for themselves when they created their own legions later in history. The Etruscans were certainly militarily formidable enough to take over Latin territory, or the future Roman people, the Latins, in the 700s to 500s, but over time, the Romans will conquer the Etruscans by about 265 to 264 BCE. And on this slide, you can see archaeological finds of Etruscan spear points made of bronze, and an Etruscan dagger. This example is actually made of bronze as well. And here is some early Etruscan or Villanovan armor, again made of bronze, although it's shown with a Greek-style hoplon round shield. Once again, seeing the fusion of Northern European and Mediterranean traditions in Etruscan armor. Here is a bronze axe head that's possibly of Etruscan origin. It's held at the Met New York City Museum. And here is a bronze chariot of Etruscan origin that was found in Perugia. And the chariot's front shows a scene from Greek mythology, specifically when Thetis, mother of Achilles, gives her almost immortal son some armor. As you know, Achilles was almost immortal except for his heel, which will ultimately be his downfall. So these artifacts show the kind of military technology that the Etruscans were using, but they also show a external influence. As I mentioned on a previous slide, over time, the Etruscans began to take on more of a Greek and Mediterranean style in their material culture, and that includes their military technology. And certainly this chariot featuring a episode from Greek mythology is evidence of this copying of Greek styles and culture. Here are some artists' recreations of what Etruscan soldiers might have looked like. We see the varieties of armor they wore early on. You can see the Northern European influence in their armor. But by later points in Etruscan history, they're making much more Greco-Roman style hoplite armor with round shields, spears, helmets with crests. So you see over time the changes in Etruscan military culture and military technology. So we'll discuss the kind of the end of the Etruscan civilization. By about 265 to 264, Rome had expanded and taken control of the Etruscan territory in northern Italy, and it would take them about 200 years to acculturate, or rather replace Etruscan culture with Roman culture, to make the Etruscans Roman. They did this by forcing the Latin language on the Etruscan people, and by actually recruiting a lot of Etruscan men to serve in the Roman military. Here we see Roman senators presiding over Etruscan soldiers joining the Roman military. It's ironic because the later Roman authors often wrote about how the Etruscans were weak and decadent and hedonistic, but many Etruscan soldiers actually would serve in the Roman military in the 200s as both soldiers and sailors, particularly in the Punic Wars. We're going to discuss the Punic Wars in a future video. But here you can just see the armor that was used by the Etruscans. Their bronze armor, iron weapons, and you can see the sort of sandal-like shoes that they would have worn, which would have allowed their soldiers to have better protection for their feet, both on the march and in battle. So now we'll shift gears and we'll talk about the Romans' neighbors much further to the north, the Celts, or the Celtic peoples. So the Celts were not one single group. Rather, they were disparate groups or tribes of people who lived in northern and western Europe. It's believed that the Celts were a Indo-European people. The evidence suggests that they were descendants of Indo-European people who migrated from the east, from what is now Russia, and then settled in Western Europe and Northern Europe. These regions, of course, were a lot less lightly populated, so the Celtic cultures of about the 1500s BCE to about the time of Julius Caesar's takeover of Gaul, it's believed that these cultures had more of an Indo-European influence than cultures to the south, like the Romans and like the Greeks. The Indo-Europeans did invade southern Europe, but those areas had larger populations, so you saw cultural syncretism between Indo-European and then local cultures of the Mediterranean. We will say, though, scholars consider the Celts as a single group, even if they were disparate tribes, because that was how ancient peoples viewed them. The Greeks viewed the Celts as a single people, calling them the Keltoi, which means the tall people or the tall ones. And there's also major artistic, cultural, and linguistic similarities between the various Celtic tribes. They spoke similar languages, or the Celtic language, in various dialects. They had a similar culture that put a lot of emphasis on the family and on textile weaving and on metalworking. And they had similar religious beliefs. But there would have been, of course, some variation between, say, a Celtic person living in what is now Spain and a Celtic person living in what is now Switzerland or northern Italy. The Celts were major trading partners with the Greeks and with the Etruscans and the Romans, and they also fought against the Greeks and the Etruscans and the Romans. And as was the case with the Etruscans, many elements of Roman culture came from the Celts. Rather, the Celts introduced many elements, particularly military cultural elements, to the Romans, in the same way that the Etruscans introduced many cultural elements to the Romans. And of course, the Celts in their time were respected as warriors and hunters and as metalworkers and weavers. This chart shows the development of the Italic or Latin languages and then the Celtic languages and how they developed from Proto-Indo-European, the language spoken by the Indo-European migrants / invaders that settled large parts of Europe and Asia. Some scholars think that there was an intermediate language that developed between Proto-Indo-European and Italic and Celtic called Italo-Celtic. We don't know for sure. Linguists debate the development of these languages. But either way, scholars generally recognize today that the people who become the Romans, they share some common ancestry with the Celtic people and with people like the Proto-Villanovans and with the Terra Mare culture. All of this happens because of the Indo-European migrations and invasions into Europe. The Indo-European people migrated through Western Europe as far as the British Isles, and they migrated down south into Italy as well, leaving a mark on the civilizations that came after them, including both the Celts and the Romans. So not only do the Romans learn a lot of things from the Celts, they also probably share a common ancestry with the Celts. Just as the Romans certainly shared a common ancestry and possible relationship with the Proto-Villanovans and the Terra Mare people. Most of the people in this part of Europe have at least some Indo-European ancestry and Indo-European developments in their culture. The Etruscans are the one kind of unusual oddball in the sense that they don't seem to have spoken an Indo-European language. So we'll talk a little bit about Celtic society as seen by their settlements. The Celts didn't typically build large cities or settlements that could be considered cities by Child's definition. These were more like large villages in many cases. But their villages are still small compared to even a village built in the Mediterranean region. The Celts built round houses with thatched roofs. The roofs, of course, are conical in shape. And these houses were big and designed to hold the entire family, suggesting sort of the tribal nature of the Celtic culture. By the way, when I say tribal, I don't mean that the Celts are primitive or that any tribal culture is primitive. Tribal cultures basically are cultures where groups of people are organized by families. And so when I say that the Celts are a tribal culture, I don't mean that they're backward. I mean that family was very important to the Celts. By the way, tribe is actually a Latin term, and tribe is often used to describe early Roman communities, which were based around family units. So these Celtic houses, they were built with local materials, wood, reeds for thatched roofs, and they'd use a little bit of stone and then mud and reeds, what's often called wattle and daub, to make the walls of their homes. So they're adapting to their environment in the way that other civilizations, like the Mediterranean civilizations, adapted to their environment. Larger settlements with bigger populations, they would build earthworks or walls called duns or dunes, depending on the Celtic dialect being used, which would have been used to protect larger communities. Here's some interiors of what Celtic houses would have looked like. They would have had a hearth in the center. They probably would have been very smoky on the inside, but people would have gone about their day and done work in these houses. Women would have worked as weavers at the loom, and men would have guarded the house, protected the house. Here we can see a dune wall around a Celtic settlement, just to give the idea that these settlements would not be considered cities in terms of their population and in terms of criteria for cities, but some of them were large enough to need walls for defense. And these are some archaeological or architectural drawings of floor plans for Celtic roundhouses. Notice the hearths in the center of the home being very important. This ditch here may have been used possibly for defensive purposes, but more likely the ditch was probably used as a place to deposit trash and night soil and waste from the houses. So this ditch, technically in archaeological terms, is probably a midden. And of course, we talked about what middens were in the first and second video of this course. Middens, of course, are an archaeological term for trash pits. And these trash pits, while the thought of them seems very disgusting, they're very useful for archaeologists. We can learn a lot about people in the past based on their trash. We can learn what they ate, what they drank, if they used ceramics. We can learn if they were sick or if they had diseases. They're a treasure trove of information for archaeologists. So we should talk about Celtic language and writing. The Celts spoke an Indo-European language that was broken into several dialects. The Celts themselves, at the time that we're talking in this course, the ancient Celts, they did not have their own writing system. Rather, they had adopted and made some slight changes to the Greek and Latin alphabets. And they used these alphabets because they were trading with the Greeks and the Romans. So it's a trade-based culture in addition to being a military culture. Later Celtic peoples, more like medieval Celtic peoples, will develop their own alphabet and a more unique writing system. But that's happening more in the medieval period. So it's a bit beyond the scope of this course. The Roman conquerors would work to suppress the Celtic languages in Gaul, what is now France, but the language would not die out completely in continental Europe. For example, Breton, which is spoken in Brittany, basically the northwest coast of France is a Celtic language. So the Romans were not able to completely eradicate the Celtic language on the European continent. And Celtic languages, of course, still exist in the British Isles. Scots Gaelic or Scottish Gaelic is a Celtic language. The original language of the Irish people is a Gaelic or Celtic language. Most people in Ireland and Scotland speak English today as their first language, but there has been an effort in recent years to teach people to speak these Celtic languages again so they will not be lost forever. The English, of course, like the Romans, had tried to encourage the Scottish and the Irish people, or rather forcibly encourage them to use English as part of their own acculturation process. So the Celts were very skilled weavers. They made clothing in a variety of colors and with a variety of patterns. And we can see this in their textiles and in their clothing. Most of the weaving work and the creation of cloth, the creation of clothing, even things like the dyeing of clothing with colors would have been done by women in Celtic society. We think that early on these colors would have denoted what tribal or community you were a part of as a Celtic person. And we can see vestiges of this today in modern Celtic cultures. Scottish people have tartans for patterns that symbolize what clan or what family they're a part of. And we think that the ancient Celts may have had a similar system. Women tended to wear long dresses with cloaks for warmth. Most of this clothing would have been made of wool, but they probably also made clothing out of linen as well, which comes from flax. Once again, Northern Europe is a lot colder than the Mediterranean, so their clothing was heavier, thicker. These cloaks were very important for warmth. Women wore much longer dresses than women in the Mediterranean did. Men actually wore trousers as well. Most Mediterranean males did not wear trousers. In fact, they thought that trousers were weird and strange. The Greeks didn't like trousers. They associated trousers with the Persians because a lot of the Persian subjects, particularly those that lived in colder mountainous areas, wore trousers. But the Celts wore trousers too. The Romans didn't like trousers either. They preferred to wear tunics and togas. Although sometimes Roman soldiers in later periods, if they were stationed in Gaul, northern France, or in Britannia, what is now England, they might wear Celtic-style trousers because they were just warmer in a cold environment. So once again, they're adapting to their environment. And also, the Celts wore different types of clothing based on their gender, based on class, and based on the activity of the wearer. Wealthier Celts could afford nicer clothing. They could also afford armor. Poorer Celts might wear simpler clothing without complex patterns. And of course, Celtic clothing was gendered. Women wore long dresses, whereas men wore shorter tunics and trousers. Here are some examples of Celtic clothing and looms. These are reproductions. We haven't found many examples of intact Celtic clothing. This is because cloth tends to dry out and as it decomposes and it falls apart. You usually don't find more than fragments in a lot of these graves. When you do find examples of preserved clothing, it's usually in places like Denmark, where the people buried their dead in peat bogs, which did a much better job of preserving their remains of the deceased, but also the clothing that they wore. But there's some debate as to whether the people living as far north as Denmark were Celtic people or if they were Germanic. So I haven't really included examples from Denmark because those may actually be more like Germanic people than Celtic people. Although there are some similarities certainly between the Germanic and Celtic peoples because both Germanic and Celtic cultures have an Indo-European influence. They inhabited a similar part of Europe, climatologically speaking, so they would have wanted to wear similar types of clothing for the weather. We also have documentary sources that describe what the Celts wore and what they look like. They come from Greek and Roman sources, and those can be used as well. We can also use what is often called comparative ethnography, We can study later cultures, especially like later medieval Celtic cultures, and we can compare those cultures and study those later cultures and use them to kind of extrapolate what earlier Celtic cultures might have looked like in their clothing. And of course, weaving was a task usually accomplished by women. It was seen as women's work in the Celtic culture, which was patriarchal, like most of the other European cultures that were around the Celts. I think there's a good argument to be made, though, that the Celtic culture is less patriarchal than other European cultures, like the Romans, for example. And you'll see why later in this video. So we have some samples of Celtic cloth, and we get an idea of the sophisticated patterns, the vivid colors that are used. We don't often know exactly what these clothes would look like. There's not a lot of visual art of clothed people in the Celtic societies of antiquity. We do think, from what limited evidence we do have, that they did like patterns, vivid colors, which the fragments we found indicate that is true. And a lot of the cloth samples we found, they come from Celtic tombs. The deceased were buried with clothing and with extra clothing that they could use in the afterlife. So, as is the case with many other ancient civilizations, studying the civilization's graves, you can learn a lot about the culture itself that produced them. Now we'll talk about Celtic tombs and burial customs in more detail. Celtic-style tombs are going to vary significantly by period and location. Celts in 1000 BC are going to be making tombs could be quite different than those being made by Celts in 500 BC, for example. And the style of tombs that the Celts make are going to be influenced by indigenous cultures that were there before the Celts. Also, I think there's evidence that the Celts may have reused tombs left behind by older societies. So you're going to see quite a variety in the style of building in which the Celts will bury their dead. Perhaps two of the most prominent tombs used by the Celts are earthen burial mounds. A lot of cultures will make burial mounds like the Celts. They also may have used rectangular stone tombs that are often referred to as barrows or menhirs. You can see an example on the left-hand side of these slides. And sometimes these tombs are made by the Celts, and other times they're actually much older than the Celts, and the Celts will just reuse the tombs because they're already there, and they may have established some ritual significance to these very old sites, or sites that were, in some cases, 1,000 years old by the time the Celts arrive. And within Celtic tombs and burials, you find social stratification with Celtic chieftains and princes having much larger tombs and a lot more grave goods than the tomb of an everyday Celtic person. There's also evidence that the Celts may have practiced secondary burial, that is, exhuming the bones of the dead and reburying them at these larger tomb complexes so they could be closer to the remains of their leaders. There's also evidence that the Celts may have practiced human sacrifice as well, having people ritually killed outside these tombs and having the recently killed be buried to act as servants to deceased chieftains and princes. Here is a Celtic tomb in France from about the 5th century BCE, and we believe this is the tomb of a very wealthy Celt, perhaps a prince or a chieftain. There are a lot of grave goods in this tomb site, a lot of very expensive grave goods, I might add. There's black figure pottery, presumably from the Mediterranean. There are bronze figures, possibly of the Etruscan style. Remember, the Celts traded with civilizations to the south, like the Etruscans, like the Greeks, and eventually with the Romans as well. And you can see the trade relationship between the Celtic peoples and civilizations to the south at this site. Some recreations of what Celtic burials or their tombs would have looked like. The deceased, especially if they were wealthy, they'd be buried with food, clothing, They might be buried with a wagon, with weapons. Wealthy men and wealthy women would be buried with grave goods. We think that the Celtic culture actually would have been somewhat more egalitarian in terms of gender by the standards of the day, and at least somewhat more egalitarian in terms of gender than, say, the Greeks and the Romans were, which their societies were highly, highly patriarchal. And oftentimes animals would be sacrificed and buried with the dead, and in some cases humans would be killed and buried with the dead, but this was rarer than animals being killed. Here's some actual Celtic human remains. We can see different types of grave goods. These are not the remains of wealthy people. They're buried with far fewer goods than a wealthy person would have been. Just some pottery and a sword scabbard, for example. Very, very simple burials compared to an elite person. So now we'll discuss the Celtic religion. There's strong European elements in the Celtic religion. Very similar, the Celtic religion is to later Germanic and Norse religions. The most important kind of Celtic god is the Dagda. He's sort of a father god, and he has a lot of similarities to Odin of Germanic peoples, or Woden of the Germanic peoples, and then of Zeus and Jupiter. Remember, I've argued that Zeus, the father of the Greek gods, or Jupiter, the father of the Roman gods, he bears more similarities to Indo-European father gods, like Odin and Woden, or in this case Dagda, than he does to Near Eastern or North African father gods. When you see religious art amongst the Celts, they portray their gods with very large heads and very small bodies. And these reliefs are usually made out of gold and silver. So they're not making their visual art of gods very, very realistic. Perhaps they're trying to capture more the elements and attributes these gods represent rather than an actual visual image of the gods, which of course is very different than how the Greeks and the Romans portrayed their gods as basically bigger, more powerful versions of humans. This is just an illustration of the family tree of the Celtic pantheon. As you can see, it's very, very complicated. Here you can see Dagda, their all-father god, and then you can see his various children that become other gods and goddesses. Bridget, for example, is sort of a female goddess of love, but also a female goddess of war, similar to like Aphrodite or Athena, better known as Venus and Minerva in the Roman case. The Celtic pantheon, of course, is very complicated, so we won't discuss it in more detail. But for those of you that are interested, this is the Celtic pantheon and family tree of the gods. Here are some depictions of Celtic gods, Celtic deities. The two on the left and center of this slide come from a cauldron from Denmark. I think this cauldron is of Celtic origin. Remember, the Celts would have traded with people to the south, but also to their north. On the right-hand side is an altar depicting Lugus or Lug, a very important Celtic deity. And the Celts, unlike the Greeks and Romans to the south, they don't seem to be as interested in portraying their deities in the human form or looking like humans. They seem to be more interested in portraying the ideals or attributes of the gods, what their character is, what they do. For example, this altar of Lug, it shows Lug with three faces to show his wisdom. Lug was a Celtic god of wisdom, a lot like the Greco-Roman deity Apollo. So having him with three faces shows his wisdom and his ability to see all things. So now we'll talk about the priests of the Celtic people, who are called the Druids. The Druid is actually from the Latin word druidei, which means oak seer. And Romans who studied the Celts or spent time amongst the Celts, like Julius Caesar, described many elements of the Celtic religion. While the Celtic religion was polytheistic, they had gods and goddesses. There's also very strong pantheistic elements in the Celtic religion, much more so than in the religion of the Greeks and the Romans. The Celts priests, the Druids, they worship trees, especially oak trees, hence the name oak seer. And their temples and religious complexes were usually set up around trees. But the Druids were more than just priests. They were part of the Celtic nobility. They were said to be able to see the future. They were almost like the scientists and philosophers of the Celtic people, which is why they've often been portrayed similar to how Greek and Roman philosophers are portrayed. They would have worn white cloaks to separate them from everyday Celts who preferred to wear bright colors and patterns. It's also believed that women could be Druids as well, although there's some debate about this, whether the women described in documentary sources were actually Druids or if they were just ordinary Celtic women engaging in religious rituals. On a more negative side, the Druids did oversee human sacrifices. Although human sacrifice, while it did take place in the Celtic societies, it was fairly rare. And many of those who were sacrificed were criminals. That doesn't necessarily justify this, but it's just something to keep in mind. So now we'll discuss some of the people who were sacrificed by the Druids. Before that, though, I want to talk a little bit about Celtic temples. Celtic temples were usually either built from wood, like this rendering shows here. It features trees in the temple complex. The Celts also liked to perform rituals at older pieces of monumental architecture, various types of stone circles, which were built by people who lived in, especially in the British Isles before the Celts. Stonehenge was not built by the Celts. Stonehenge was probably about 2,000 years old by the time the Celts reached the British Isles. But later Celtic peoples would use Stonehenge for rituals. And other smaller kind of stone circles would be used for rituals as well, even if they'd been built by earlier civilizations. Some of the sacrifice rituals. One is the Wicker Man. This is a much later, early modern depiction of the Wicker Man, in which people would be placed inside of a wooden and wicker skeleton, human skeleton, and then lit on fire. Sacrifices would be performed, as I mentioned, at Stonehenge. In general, it was criminals and people who had done things in life that were considered wrong who were sacrificed. Doesn't justify this, but it's just something to keep in mind. So now we'll discuss the bog mummies. These are probably the most famous of the Celtic sacrificial victims. We have two examples here on this slide. On the left is Cloney Cavan Man, found in Ireland. He probably died sometime between 392 and 201 BCE. Studies of his hair show that he had traces of Spanish pine resin in his hair, basically ancient hair gel, and a cosmetic item like this would have been very expensive, so this man was most likely a king or a chieftain. He also, the evidence shows that he ate well. He ate a very balanced diet, unlike a lot of other poorer people who would have eaten diets based much more heavily on grains. On the right here is not a complete articulated human body, but it's the torso of the old Krogan man, who probably lived and died sometime between 362 and 175 BCE, also in Ireland. It's believed that he, based on his wingspan or arm span, would have been about 6'6" in life, or 6 feet 6 inches in life, well over 2 meters tall. Autopsies performed on the remains show that both of these men were brutally killed and probably tortured and mutilated before they were buried in bogs. And a lot of these bogs went up in lakes at the time, but they became bogs as the centuries passed. The Celts probably were not trying to preserve the bodies. This just happened as a natural process from the peat bogs of northern Europe. They are very, very acidic, and that keeps away microbes that break down dead bodies, and it also keeps air out, so these bodies are well preserved. And of course, in the center, this is actually a facial reconstruction of what Cloney Cabin Man may have looked like in life, with his slick back hair with the pine resin. What we think is that the Celts, in rituals like this, they were sacrificing upper class people, possibly even their kings and chieftains. And they probably did this if there was a bad harvest, or if the tribe lost a war. Remember, these tribes were disparate groups. Sometimes they fought amongst each other, and basically you would sacrifice your leader because they'd done a poor job in leadership. Or, in the case of a famine, they hadn't done a bad job, but the assumption was the tribe was being punished with a famine by the gods, and therefore they had to offer up their chieftain as a sacrifice to get into good graces with their deities once again. These are actually not the best preserved bog mummies that are available. Some of the best preserved ones are in Denmark. But there's debate about whether those bodies were buried by Celtic people or by Germanic people. So I chose these two examples from Ireland, which are fairly well preserved, but not perfectly, or not as well preserved as others. So now we'll talk about Celtic weapons. The Celts were very skilled ironworkers and warriors. Swords were one of their favorite weapons. They made a variety of swords. They made a short, straight sword, like this one here, or this one. They also made curved swords. They're a little bit like scythes. These curved swords were probably made more in Eastern Celtic territories, like what is now Eastern Europe and the Balkans, whereas these straight swords were popular more in what is now France, or what was called Gaul by the Romans. And the Romans would have been more familiar with this type of sword. And it's believed that the Romans copied their short sword called the gladius off of Celtic short swords. But many other elements of Roman armor and equipment, military equipment, are similar to Celtic arms and equipment. And of course, the Celts used other weapons. They used axes, spears, ranged weapons like bows and arrows, and they used chariots as well. And their shields, they made a variety of types of shields, but they were usually oblong, either oblong and rectangular or oblong and oval shaped. And the Romans will make their shields oblong, like the Celts, rather than the Greeks, who preferred round, circular shields. Here's just some of the sword hilts we found amongst the Celts. You can see the level of sophistication in their workmanship. Just to highlight, once again, the Celts were skilled ironworkers, and they also put a lot of emphasis on a warrior culture, a military culture. Here are some other examples of Celtic military technology. Here are their oblong shields, which the Romans copied when they made their scutum shields. These are both about 30 inches long, and they're both from the UK. This is what maybe an everyday shield would have looked like, made of wood. These shields here are probably more ceremonial and not used in combat. Here are some bronze arrowheads that were made by, presumably by Celtic people. The Celts used not only melee weapons like swords, but ranged weapons as well. And here are some axe heads. Axes were very popular weapons for the Celts. Celtic helmets are very interesting. We can really see how the Celtic helmets would have influenced later Roman elements, or Roman helmets. This helmet here, with its cheek plates and neck guard, is very similar to the helmets worn by later Roman legionaries. And this helmet, by the way, is from 2 to 300 BCE. So This is the Celts influencing the Romans, not the Romans influencing the Celts. But the Celts also made very beautiful, really, ceremonial helmets. This helmet's from Agris, and this helmet's from Waterloo. This is from the 400s BC, and this is from the 150s BCE. This helmet has horns. We don't think that horned helmets would have been worn in combat. Not very practical. They are heavy, and they give an enemy something that they could grab, and then defeat their foe more easily by grabbing a horn. So horn helmets were probably worn more for ceremonial purposes, we think. Here are just some artists' reconstructions of Celtic warriors. Contrary to what a lot of films would have you believe, the Celtic warriors did not fight always naked or shirtless. Some certainly would have, especially light infantry, men who were lightly armed and who would move quickly around the battlefield. But wealthier men would have worn a lot more armor. They would have worn chainmail. It's believed that chainmail was actually a Celtic invention from about the 500s BCE, and they would have had, of course, oblong swords, and they would have had helmets with cheek plates and then with a neck guard in the back. So you can see a very, very clear Roman, or the Romans will really copy many elements of Celtic military technology. And of course, they used chariots as well. As I mentioned, not all Celtic warriors fought with, no clothing on. Some might have, but this would have been more so they could move more quickly around the battlefield. Wealthy soldiers would have worn, heavier armor and more clothing. The Celts did paint themselves with like blue paint. This is believed to have evolved as a way to either cover up or treat wounds. This paint may have actually been some type of medicine. But over time it became more decorative and associated with the Celtic culture. There's also evidence that the Celts, their warriors may have had tattoos also. The Celts also allowed women to serve as warriors. The most famous female warrior of the Celts is probably Boudica, who led a rebellion against the Romans in Britain in about the 60s CE. Also, male warriors often washed their hair in lime, which would have bleached their hair and given it sort of a grayish, whitish, blonde look. It also would have made it look a lot spikier, which would have made them look taller and more intimidating. They also would have grown long mustaches as well, again, to look more intimidating. So because the Celts were very skilled warriors, one tribe of Celts, led by Brennus, was able to defeat the Romans at the Battle of Allia. Now, Brennus outnumbered the Romans by nearly 2 to 1. By the way, this is Brennus who attacked the Romans. Another Brennus about 100 years later would invade Greece. So don't want to get those two terms confused, those two names confused. So the Roman army's defeat after the Battle of Allia opened Rome up for destruction and sacking by the Celts. After sacking Rome, Brennus was eventually driven out of Italy by Roman general Camillus. So he sacked Rome but did not completely conquer the Romans. The Romans would rebuild their city, and they would rebuild with larger, thicker walls. But this sacking did lead to increased anti-Celtic xenophobia in Roman culture. And the Celtic sack of Rome would inspire later Roman wars against the Celts. And this is an image of Celts and hoplites fighting. Romans often wore Greek-style armor at this point in their history, in the late 300s BCE. Over time, they're going to develop their own armor, often by using Celtic military technology, which you'll see in later videos. Some scenes from the Battle of Allia and after. Brennus went to the gates of Rome, and the Romans tried to placate him by giving him gold. And Brennus was said to say, "Ve victus," to the victor go the spoils, and took the gold and then destroyed the city anyway. So it's said that he captured Rome through treachery, not through sheer military strength. Again, the impact of the Celtic sack on Rome. Roman society was already militaristic at the time of the Celtic invasion and sacking, but the Romans became more militaristic afterwards. They built thicker walls for the city of Rome. They adopted elements of the Celtic military, the people who had defeated them. These oblong shields, helmets with cheek plates and neck guards, short swords like the gladius. Increased elements of anti-Celtic xenophobia also became common, and these would culminate with Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul, Celtic territory in what is now France, and then the Emperor Claudius's conquest of Britain, Celtic territory, and of course what is now England. So we'll finish this video by discussing Rome's neighbor to the south, the Carthaginians. And the Carthaginians did not have the kind of cultural influence on the Romans that the Etruscans or the Celts did. But they're still an important civilization. Rome's conflicts with the Carthaginians had a major impact on the development and the course of Roman civilization. We'll discuss the wars between the Romans and the Carthaginians in a future video. But in this video, I want to talk a little bit about Carthaginian culture. So the Carthaginians, they established their city in Carthage, what is now Tunisia, in about 814 to 813 BCE. The city was said to be founded by a woman named Elisa, who would become the basis for the later Roman legend of Dido. We'll talk about Dido in a moment. The Carthaginians, like the Phoenicians, who were their forebears actually, they were very skilled seafarers. They were good sailors. They were good maritime merchants. But unlike their Phoenician founders, the Carthaginians were a lot more warlike. And they built an empire in the Western Mediterranean that spread across North Africa, Western North Africa, and then northward into Iberia, what is now Spain, and even into Sicily and parts of other northern Mediterranean islands. These are, of course, symbols of the Carthaginian civilization, a sailing vessel, and then this is a stele featuring the goddess Tanit, or the symbol for the goddess Tanit, who was a major goddess in the Carthaginian Phoenician religion. And of course, there's an inscription to Tanit written in the Phoenician alphabet down here. This is the Carthaginian Empire. As you can see, it spreads across Western North Africa and then into Spain, and even for a period they control both Corsica and Sardinia and about half of Sicily. Rome at this point is a fairly minor civilization. They have taken over or are working on taking over the Etruscan Empire, but they're mostly confined to the Italian peninsula at this point. The Carthaginians expanded into Spain and maintained territory in Spain largely because there were silver mines in Spain, particularly around Gades or Gadir, which is near the modern Spanish city of Cadiz. And of course, this silver mining, along with their maritime trade, like the Phoenicians, they produced purple dye. Things like silver, purple dye, they made the Carthaginian civilization, Carthaginian Empire, very wealthy. And after the ancestral cities of the Phoenicians are destroyed, Carthage remains the last vestige of the Phoenician civilization, although the Carthaginians were much more warlike than their Phoenician forebears. There's shipwrecks of Carthaginian ships across the Mediterranean, so we have a good idea of the kind of goods they were carrying and just how much overseas trade they were involved in, maritime trade they were involved in. They were also very skilled explorers. We think that the Carthaginians reached Ireland and Britain and explored those areas. Some even think that the Carthaginians may have sailed all the way around Africa, or they think the Phoenicians completed that voyage. There's some debate as to whether they actually completed that voyage. And there's also some who think that the Carthaginians maybe even sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, although that seems very unlikely in my opinion. I don't think their sailing ships, sophisticated as they were for the time, would have been strong enough to sail across the Atlantic Ocean. I'll briefly touch on the legend of Aeneas and Dido. Dido was probably based on Queen Elisa, who was a real historical figure. Dido herself, though, the chronology is not accurate historically or archaeologically. So this is a myth or a legend created by the Roman poet Virgil much later in history as a way to explain the long-term rivalry between the Carthaginians and the Romans in what were called the Punic Wars, or the wars with Carthage. Punic, of course, being the Latin term for Carthaginians. Aeneas of Troy was said to be the founder of the Roman people. He fled Troy after it was destroyed by the Greeks in about the 1200s BCE, and then he met Dido and had a relationship with her, but then went on to the Italian peninsula to found the people who would become the Romans. Dido became very sad and angry that Aeneas left her, and because of that, the Carthaginians and the Romans were said to have been long-standing rivals because of this sort of ruined relationship, a spurned lover in Dido. Historically speaking, this story doesn't make sense. Carthage was not established until the 800s BCE, whereas Troy, or at least the Troy of Aeneas, was destroyed in the 1200s BCE, so 400 years too early. But this myth is still useful because it explains Roman culture and how the Romans tried to explain their rivalry and their war against the Carthaginians, which will be the subject of future videos. So now that we've discussed the legend of Dido and Aeneas, we'll discuss Carthaginian religion. It's a polytheistic religion. They have multiple gods, like the Phoenicians and like so many other ancient Mediterranean civilizations. The Carthaginian religion was also culturally syncretistic. It had elements of North African, Near Eastern, and even European traditions. This is the goddess Tanit, the wife of their god Baal or Baal. These are probably the most important deities to the Carthaginians. These are Phoenician gods. So it makes sense that the Phoenician gods are the most important in their pantheon. There's also evidence to suggest that Carthaginian society was less patriarchal than other ancient Mediterranean civilizations. Women featured prominently in Carthaginian religious rituals, particularly as priests. The Carthaginians, on a more negative side, did practice human sacrifice, particularly of infants and young children. That's been something that's been debated by scholars for many years. For many years, they said that human sacrifice was something that happened. Then for a while in the mid to late 20th century, they said that it was made up by Roman and Hebrew writers as a way to make the Carthaginians and the Phoenicians look bad. Basically, there was a form of propaganda. More recent archaeological discoveries, however, have corroborated that human sacrifice, particularly child sacrifice, did take place. And some elements of the Carthaginian religion would survive even after Carthage was destroyed. They would survive as late as the 300s CE. So now we'll discuss some of the archaeological evidence for Carthaginian child sacrifice. We found cremated remains of children and infants, alongside inscriptions saying that the children had been offered to the gods. Some tried to argue that these sites, which were called tophets or tophets, were actually just cemeteries where deceased children were buried after being cremated. Their ashes would be put into jars like this, and ashes with animal bones or burned animal remains have been found also. These sites have been found throughout the Carthaginian Empire. Studies done on the cremated human remains suggest these were healthy children who died. So they did not die of natural causes, which would go along with ancient documentary sources which said that the Carthaginians engaged in child sacrifice. Some more points about the Carthaginian religion and about child sacrifice. This is Baal Haman, kind of the sort of the king of the Carthaginian pantheon, somewhat similar to Zeus, but with some differences as well. He is the husband of Tanit. It's He's one of the gods that would have received child sacrifices. Here is a child sacrifice stele that commemorates the sacrifice of a child. There's the symbol of Tanit, and then there's an inscription in the Phoenician language. Some people tried to argue that this was basically just a gravestone or a tombstone, but more recent scholarship believes that these were sacrificial victims who were killed to honor the gods. Here are a collection of the stelae that would mark those that were sacrificed. Before 1935, a lot of scholars believe the Carthaginians offered their infant and child sacrifices to a deity called Moloch or Molech, which Molech is a Hebrew term actually that was used by the Greeks and Romans. Nowadays, scholars think that Molech may have been more of a technical term for human sacrifice or child sacrifice. And there's debate over whether sacrificial victims were killed before their bodies were burned or if they were burned alive. Some documentary sources suggest that they were burned alive. Others are less clear, so we don't really know for sure. Here's some other Carthaginian religious artifacts that highlight the cultural syncretism of their religion. Here in the center is a statue to the Egyptian goddess Sekhmet, who had the head of a lion or a cat, but was also worshipped by the Carthaginians. The statue's in a Carthaginian style. It's not in an Egyptian style. And it was found near Carthage. This is a mask. It's called a sardo mask. These were masks that were used for religious rituals in the island of Sardinia. By the way, the term sardonic comes from sardo. Sardonic, of course, meaning having a happy expression about something that is bad. And this is a sarcophagus of a priestess. And you can see the similarities between the garb of a Carthaginian priestess and Egyptians, particularly in the clothing and the headdress that she is shown to be wearing. Here is a shot of some architecture in Carthage. It's possibly either Greco-Roman or Carthaginian. Some archaeologists debate whether the Carthaginians built arches or if they did not build arches. If they built arches, then this site was probably built by later Roman architects who rebuilt Carthage after it was destroyed in 146 BCE in the third and final Punic War. Here's another shot of some architecture in Carthage. This arch here may have been built by later Roman architects, as is the case with these columns. It's hard to say. The Carthaginians were in contact with many civilizations in the ancient Mediterranean, but a lot of archaeologists think that the Carthaginians chose not to build arches. So this actually may be later Roman architecture that was built on the new Roman Carthage that was built over the old destroyed Carthage. This slide shows an image of what I believe is Punic Carthaginian architecture. That is, architecture built in Carthage, the Carthage of the Phoenician Carthaginian people, not the Carthage that was rebuilt by the Romans later on. The Punic Carthaginians seem to have built very square, boxy buildings, much more of a Middle Eastern style than a Greco-Roman style. You can see the sort of square columns and square and rectangular foundations of these buildings. It's good evidence that this is some Punic architecture that was left over from when Carthage was inhabited by the Carthaginian Punic people before the city was destroyed and rebuilt by the Romans. Here is a construction of Carthage before it was destroyed by the Romans. The Romans will destroy the city of Carthage, and then they will rebuild it in a Greco-Roman style later. But this is what Carthage looked like pre-Roman destruction. You can see very rectangular, box-shaped buildings. Although they do build a very elaborate harbor. This is an artificial harbor, which is called a kothon or kothon. They put a lot of effort into building this harbor because they're a seafaring maritime people. They have lots of trade ships and they have a large navy. So a harbor like this is essential for their civilization's economic and military success. This is reconstructions of what may have been a shipyard slash naval base inside of the Kothon. Once again, highlighting the skill that the Carthaginians had, both as sailors and as shipbuilders. Now I'll talk about some of the archaeological finds at Gadir, also known as Gades, near present-day Cadiz, Spain. Gadir was a silver mining town. So the people living in Gadir probably would have been fairly wealthy, and they would have brought a lot of wealth into the Carthaginian Empire. And the architecture of Gadir has Greco-Roman influences, which you'll see on the next slide, but there is also what I believe is Punic-style architecture there. You know, this very boxy, sort of square-shaped style of building that's much more Near Eastern in style than Greco-Roman. But the Carthaginians, they borrowed and took ideas from other cultures in the Mediterranean, certainly from the Greeks and the Romans. But they may have also copied the Egyptians as well. These sarcophagi are anthropoid, like Egyptian sarcophagi, and they may have practiced mummification as well, alongside cremation. So they may have had multiple different styles of burial, reflecting kind of the cultural syncretism of the Carthaginian people. As they traded and took ideas from other cultures, they may have borrowed Egyptian ideas. And this, of course, reflects the diversity of the Mediterranean peoples, the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, the Carthaginians, etc. On the subject of mummification, I only found one source that mentioned Carthaginians practicing mummification, and the article I don't think was originally in English, so there may have been translation issues. So that's a possibility, but I can't confirm it. So it's possible that the Carthaginians practiced mummification, and it wouldn't surprise me because they had interactions with the Egyptians, but I can't confirm it, but I thought it was worth mentioning. I know for sure that the Carthaginians practiced cremation, as we showed on previous slides. Here's some columns, Greco-Roman style columns from later on. The Romans inhabited a lot of Carthaginian cities and sites after they conquered the Carthaginian Empire. So we'll talk about Carthaginian burial rituals briefly. Carthaginians like to bury their dead with seashells or with seashell jewelry. Wealthier people might be buried with a necklace like this one with seashells. The seashells would have highlighted the maritime nature of their culture, the importance of seafaring. Also, the purple dye that had made the old Phoenician Empire very wealthy was made from seashells, from a mollusk. So it's sort of a nod to their seafaring, but also to their trade. Poorer people would have been buried just with seashells. Wealthier Carthaginians, in addition to having sarcophagi, they also would have had mausoleums. These mausoleums have some similarity, I think, to Persian-style mausoleums in the sense that they're built kind of almost like step pyramids with multiple levels. This one is actually built in what is now Tunisia, and it was built for a elite person who died in the region and who could afford to hire several laborers to build the mausoleum for him. This is a reconstructed version of the mausoleum. When it was first discovered, it looked like this. The upper section had fallen apart. So, conclusion. The neighboring peoples of Northern Europe and of the Mediterranean and the Italian peninsula heavily influenced Roman culture and the course of Roman civilization. The Etruscans, the first civilization we talked about in this video, they brought many elements of Greek culture, secondhand Greek culture, to the Romans. especially when it came to architecture, dress, and religion. The Celts introduced a lot of military technologies to the Romans, and they made Roman society more militaristic, as seen during their invasion of Roman territory and their sacking of Rome in about 378 BCE. And the Carthaginians, while the Romans did not take as many cultural elements from the Carthaginians were major territorial rivals for the Romans. Both were trying to build empires in the Mediterranean, and that led to a series of wars called the Punic Wars, which were wars in which the Romans ultimately prevailed, and the Punic Wars were a major turning point in early Roman history. But we'll talk more about the Punic Wars in future videos.